Hello and welcome to the Study Legal English podcast. I'm your host Louise, and today I've got a very special guest on the show. It's Richard Lackey. Hi Richard.
Hi Louise, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. So Richard is a legal translator. He's got over 10 years of experience. He founded a company called Contractually Speaking Ltd, which is a London-based translation company specialising in legal translations. Mm-hmm. He translates from French and Spanish to English, and he's written many articles about legal translation, carried out courses, training for legal translators, and I came across Richard because you're very active on social media.
A little bit, yeah.
Very active on LinkedIn, and Richard had posted something about a Ken Adams course, I think, something like that. You'd been on a Ken Adams course, I think, and it caught my attention, and I thought, I'd like to interview you. So I'm very pleased to have you in the hot seat today to ask you lots of questions about your work as a legal translator. So are you ready for lots of questions?
Yeah, look, go for it. Yeah.
And one other point is that we're here on a lovely summer's day just in front of Waterloo Bridge, so it's quite a nice
quite
occasion.
A rare occasion, yeah.
Very
nice.
lovely.
Yeah.
So first of all, Richard, I know a little bit about legal translation, but probably my knowledge is quite limited, and in my idea of it, it's that you translate legal documents. But can you explain exactly what it is? What happens from when you get a quote in your inbox to this final polished piece of legal translation work? What does it involve?
Okay, so first of all, you're right, translation is always a document. So interpreting is interpreting the spoken form, whereas translation is always the written form. And basically, from when you first get a document, what you first need to do are just to check the basics that it is something that you feel comfortable translating. So I translate legal things, but quite often a client will say this is a legal document, but it might have. Then it turns out it might have some architectural content or some engineering content. So first of all, I'd always check that I can translate it, or if I need to go and find someone to help me with certain parts of a document. And then the other thing, sometimes clients can be juggling lots of different documents, so making sure that it is actually in the language they've said. They might say it's French and it turns out it's German and they just hadn't checked. So there's the kind of first checks that you do when you get a document. And yeah, making sure that you feel comfortable translating the content. So I receive most of my emails, with my clients, my work by email. So I'll get sort of either a scanned file or a Word file to look through. And as translators, we have a few bits of software that we can use to help us. So basically, that just makes it into a working space where we can work, and we can access a glossary and a record of previous translations that we've worked on. So if we've translated a certain phrase before, we can find how we've translated that again. It's quite useful.
Yeah,
so there's a few softwares that are available. I use one called SDL Studio Trados. So very useful one. So basically the stages are that I will translate it, and the best practice is to get somebody else to review my translation as well. So the same way as if you were drafting something, you want someone to check without on any obvious omissions, typos or mistakes in the translation. So often I'll send the work off to a colleague who will then review it for me, send it back, and then I'll make the final changes. Yeah.
And then is that finished? Is it you send it off to the client?
It can be, yeah. So clients often might need a translation for different purposes, sometimes just to understand it, or sometimes they might be negotiating a contract, so they might come back with further changes and then need to update the translation accordingly. So those are the kind of things that might happen.
Okay, good, very good explanation of the process of what you do. And the first time I think I came across legal translation as a job was when I heard Juliet Scott speak, who's a very well-known, very well-respected linguist and translator. I heard her speak a couple of years ago at a legal English conference, Stop, it's so complicated. Why do you do it, Richard?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes more than others. I've always liked languages, so I grew up learning to speak French at home. My mum speaks French and Spanish. My grandfather also spoke French, so languages had always run in the family, and being able to work with languages was really a benefit for me. So I really enjoyed getting to work with languages on a daily basis. And then it's an added bonus to be working from one legal system to another. It's really interesting to be exploring those differences, especially between the civil law countries and common law. It does really raise a minefield of difficulties with the terminology sometimes.
Yeah.
So you're always busy, you're always thinking carefully about how to work from one language to the other, and it's a really interesting job, actually.
Yes.
But some of those difficulties can be hard to overcome. So sometimes, for example, you'll have a difficulty of false equivalences, where there might be a term that sounds quite similar to another one in another language, but actually it's defined in a completely different way. So you do have to really bear down to the roots of where terms come from, maybe go back to the legislation or the case law to look up its origins, and then be able to translate it from there. So there is a lot at play when you're working in translation.
Okay, and I had a look on your website, and you mentioned that you're very, and even, I mean, I can tell when you post stuff on LinkedIn that you're very pro a modern style of drafting, and you mentioned on your site that that's your style that you like to translate into. You give this example of the modern style versus the kind of old traditional, some might say the archaic style. I think you give like an example of a date. So you mentioned like a traditional style might translate a date as on this day of the 26th of May 2019, everything written, whereas a modern style would just simply say on 26th of May 2019 with the numbers.
Sure.
Why is it that you prefer this modern style?
Yeah, so I think really between like a modern or a traditional or even archaic style, that's perhaps just an oversimplification. There's definitely a range between the two. And the date example is just a simple one as well. In Spanish or French documents, you tend to find they will sometimes write it out fully in words, and then in English you can just simply write it in a short date format. But it's really just to try to give a simple example of what's a bigger issue at play. So I think as a translator, you're always working as an interpretation of the text. So it's not that there's a right or a wrong answer always, but you're trying to put it to a way that's easy for the reader to understand. And with some documents, you're almost reading something that's almost unintelligible. It's really very, very difficult to pick apart. So I feel for the reader who perhaps is only going to spend a short time or just wants to get there quicker, it's better to, once you've picked apart something very complex, to put it back into a form that's easier to read without adding any extra or less ambiguities, or without changing the meaning, just making it in an easier form for the reader to get to. I would definitely recommend just writing in a short date format, rather than on the 2nd of the month of the year, etc. But that really just encapsulates a bigger problem that we face as translators. We have to try to find what our clients want as well. So that's also an issue when clients don't always give you feedback on what they want, or they don't always give you feedback on they don't tell you the purpose of the translation before you start it. So Juliet Scott has done quite a bit of work on that. It's actually her PhD thesis that was published in I think it's Legal Translation Outsourced, which came out last year. So there's a lot of interesting work in there. But often clients don't fully say the purpose of the translation. So she came up with a template in her book on how we could make a better brief for translators to give to get the purpose of the translation. And I sometimes find with my clients that I also have to say how I would translate it, and then we get some feedback going there as well. So you tend to build up kind of a style sheet for each client on what their personal preferences are between different terms or different styles of translation as well.
any difficulties with clients? Like, for example, if they perhaps don't like this modern style, they prefer, maybe they challenge you on some of the translations or the changes, maybe like the shorter sentences, they prefer the longer sentences. Have you had anything like that?
Sure, yeah, you do get some pushback from clients sometimes. So when you're saying changing sentences, sometimes a Spanish document can come up with a sentence that's 150 words, 200 words, and you can actually split that into smaller sentences without changing the meaning. So I will try to do that when I can. I find some of the clients that give more pushback tend to be perhaps European lawyers who don't speak English as their first language, and they are more trained in the French or the Spanish style, or perhaps Italian too, I imagine, and they see that they think their language should be legalese. They think that it should be that, whereas they don't realise that the trends are changing, especially in the UK or Australia and the States too, I'd say. But they don't see that that these changes are taking place, so they can be quite anti more modern English, or quite anti some of the ideas that Ken Adams would have, for example.
And if you have a client that does take that stance, do you try to explain, I don't know, the benefits of using this more modern style, or do you kind of just say, okay?
Yeah, no, I would definitely try to explain that this is a more established English, or this is these are the benefits of using this type of English. But it can come to an extreme where you just say, look, maybe it's better if you find another translator because you're trying to do something that's not necessary, and I don't really want to carry on working on this basis. So that has happened once or twice, but it's very, very rare, really. That extreme.
It can be quite challenging if somebody is absolutely like dead set on this traditional style and has the idea that this is what it means to be a lawyer is to use some really heavy legalese. I can understand that, it might feel like you're talking to a brick wall in some cases. It can be quite difficult. It's one of the challenges that I'm sure a lot of people listening to the podcast will sympathise or empathise with you on that situation.
I think so, yeah. I think perhaps some translators will prefer more the traditional style, but then I think there will be others who will prefer more modern style as well. So there will be both camps on the client and on the provider side as well.
Yes, yeah. I have to say I'm more pro on the modern style as well, and also in my teaching techniques I always try to stay on the more modern style. But it's important to understand the archaic style as well. Okay,
And I think it's important to say that you wouldn't change things unnecessarily. If it was a part of the document that had already been written in English or something, and you were trying to, or you were updating a translation, and then 95% or 90% of it had been done already, you wouldn't go back and change all of that either. It's really about balance and finding the right point there.
Yes. So how do you make decisions about the kind of style that you will use?
I actually am quite interested in this question. I did a survey together with a colleague last year, and we tried to measure how other translators working in the same language pair are making some of the decisions. So if you have a look at my blog, I've got the results of that survey there. And basically we just asked translators 10 questions on how would you translate this phrase? Would you choose this version or this version? So we really tried to pick apart between a more modern or a more traditional style. So I personally would go for more of a modern style, but I wanted to see what others would choose there. So I think it's really interesting when you start to ask how people translate things, because everyone translates in a different way. But you just tend to find sort of two camps there.
Yes. Oh, I'm curious to know the results. I'm going to be looking up on your blog straight after this interview.
We've got all the results there.
Yeah, okay, I will leave a link to that. That's quite interesting. Okay, so you mentioned a couple of resources already. You said that you use specific, so I can't remember the name of them, but I will leave any links that we mentioned today, I'll leave in the show notes.
Sure.
So how do you stay up to date? Are there any other resources that you recommend?
I like Ken Adams' blog and his book as well, The Manual of Style for Contract Drafting. Brian Gardner's got a few books that were worth reading as well. I actually published a short reading list earlier this year that had a few books that I found quite useful. But also attending workshops in law and things, and workshops and talks and staying up to date with reading as well.
Yes, I saw your post about the books that you recommended, and I'll leave a link to it for this, because it was quite a good list.
Just a very short list really, but some ideas that I found useful.
Yeah, very helpful, very helpful. And so moving on, there's been a lot of talk recently, it's been going on for quite a long time, about AI and translation, and some people fear that because of machine learning, these automated contract drafters and automated translators will take all of the jobs of real human being translators like yourself. How do you feel about this, or what's your take on it?
I think machine translation is getting better. It is out there, but also I think you have to be wary of some of the claims being made, that it's reaching human parity or things like that, which are clearly not true. And also be wary of who are making the claims. Often it's people who are selling machine translation or who are researching machine translation, so they do have sort of an
agenda.
An agenda there. Machine translation is also changing as well. So previously it was a statistical model, and now it's a neural model, which are the new models being used by Google and other machine translation groups, and they are actually changing in the risks involved there as well. So because of the way that they work, they can be increasing the risks that they're putting into the translation. So you do see some that while it may read better, it may look more like a polished copy, it's actually obviously not somebody thinking behind it. It's just it's a machine that's trying to produce a more polished copy, and sometimes that can increase the errors of omitting a negative, or putting in a negative where there wasn't one in the original, or using false equivalences, or repeating translation mistakes that have already been put out there, so they can propagate those mistakes. So I don't see it taking away our jobs as translators now, but I do see it perhaps being used more on some of the easier things, or where there's lower risk content. So for translators, I think there'll always be work out there, but it may be that we work more on high risk and high value documents, and it may be that it's more specialized content as well, that you work more with a legal translator, or very highly specialized legal translator, rather than some of the easier translation work that was available before, perhaps.
Yes, because I mean, always it seems like as a translator, one of the most crucial things that you do is that you make those choices between, when there are these, when there is a choice of two different words that you could use, that's where it comes down to a really, really important thing that you do.
Yeah, it can come down to very nuanced decisions there, very fine decisions.
And that could be very difficult or very easy for a machine to get wrong if they maybe choose one because it's used more frequently or something like that, haven't got the full context and the knowledge of the legal system behind you. Yes, very interesting. And so one other point I'd like to ask you is that for people who are interested in a career in legal translation, do you have any tips for them?
Sure, a lot of the national translation organisations provide some really good advice or workshops. So in the UK you've got the Institute of Translation and Interpreting, the ITI, and the Chartered Institute of Linguists, the COL, who both provide some really good material on their websites. I think they do a joint day in June and in September in London at the University of Westminster. There's quite a good taster day, and they have some short videos and leaflets on their websites. And then for the other countries, in France there's the SFT, in Spain ACITRAD, or there's various different translation arbitration bodies. That would be a really good place to look at. But the advice for translators, or for people interested in going into translation, is really to have a specialism, to either bring something from your background or to develop a specialism as you go along.
That's a very good point. And what about if they do choose legal English? Do you have any words of warning or words of wisdom?
I think try to get a mentor out there. There's some really good mentoring schemes, and there's really basically it's quite a complex task. So if you can have somebody to review your translations, then that can be a really good way to get better. And I think working with a partner is always very advantageous.
Yes, that sounds like a really good way to work. And what has been like a great achievement for you as a translator? Have there been any key documents that you translated that you thought, yes? Okay.
Well, actually, one job that was quite interesting last year was a website for a law firm, and they were translating all their content to be able to try and find more clients in the States or elsewhere in Europe. So it was really interesting to work with them and discuss very carefully with them how they presented the tone of the website. And actually that changed quite a lot from French to English, because in French you would find a very, very formal style in your marketing documents, whereas in English you could change it up a bit, and you could go for a slightly more relaxed tone and go for slightly shorter sentences and things like that. So it was very interesting to work on that job.
Very nice. I think that's one difficulty that sometimes non-native speakers have with English, is getting the register right. Even sometimes with emails, like they overdo it on the politeness, or they then do it too direct, or they use too much formal language. So I can imagine that was quite an interesting job and very useful for the law firm. So
definitely, and I hope it found them some more business as well. So obviously it was very important to them, so we discussed it quite a lot over the phone to try and perfect everything in there.
Great, so thank you, Richard. That's been really, really, helpful and insightful, and very nice to learn about your work. So thank you for coming on the show.
No, thank you, Louise. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, no problem. And for listeners out there, I highly recommend that you check out Richard's website. It is www.contractually-speaking.co.uk. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Perfect. And I also recommend that you connect with Richard on LinkedIn, look him up, and on Twitter you can find him, is it at Contract Speak?
Contract Speak, that's right.
Contract Speak. So find him on Twitter, because you often post really helpful stuff, so
good.
Very, very good. And for more information you can head over to studylegalenglish.com. So thanks for listening, and see you next time.